Hey there, I'm Douglas from DraftBit, and today we're going to be talking about the pressable component. This is a component which is an updated and more advanced version of the touchable component. It's recommended to use a pressable instead of a touchable for most interactions inside your application. To add a pressable component, go to the component picker and click Add. Then we're going to search for the pressable component. Then we click it. One thing to note, the pressable works similarly to a view component, meaning it can hold other components inside it. For example, we can place an image inside the pressable to make it interactive. So let's go ahead to the pressable, click Add, then let's have an image inside. So by doing this, our image is now interactive. We can now, so here on the device preview, let's go to web preview, and we're going to be able to click the image. So now notice when we hover over the image, we get this pointer that shows that the image is now pressable. Now we can press the image. So the pressable component comes with some interactions. If we go to interactions, we have access to on press, we have access to on long press. So on press, this interaction is triggered when the user taps on the pressable component. So when I tap, this triggers the on press. And it's most common, for creating touchable buttons or areas that respond to simple press. Then up next, we have on long press. This interaction is triggered when the user holds down the pressable for a longer duration. So on press, we just come onto our image or onto our pressable view. We click and it triggers on press. On long press, we have to hold and then that gets triggered. And then to see this in action, on press, I'm going to add a console to the screen that says pressable clicked. And then on long press, I'm going to do something similar and say pressable long pressed. And then now when I have my console log open and I click, you see pressable has been clicked. And it's not just the image, it's this whole width, right? I can click here since this whole view is covered by the pressable. And then when I long click, right, you see pressable long pressed. So here it's not just about console logging. As I always say, we can do anything that we want here. When we press, we can, for example, make an API request to the backend and do some certain actions. So yeah, let's just remove that and move on. Then up next, we have the config. So on config, the first thing that we have is component name. You can give your pressable component a custom name. This is helpful for organizing your project, especially if you have multiple components, so it gets to make sense. So right now we have pressable. Let's say we had multiple pressables, it wouldn't make sense. We wouldn't be able to identify which is which. That's why we need to have a sensible name on our component name. Then up next, we have active opacity. This property allows you to control the opacity of the pressable when it's pressed. By lowering the opacity, you give users visual feedback showing that the component has been successfully tapped. So when we click, right, as you can notice, the image inside the pressable becomes a bit opaque, right? So we control that with this active opacity. So if we come here and we go on active opacity and then we say 0.3, for example, now when I click, it's going to be more pale. And then if I say 0.9, it will be more visible. So now when I click, it's more visible. So you can just play around with that. And up next, we have delay long press. This defines the duration in milliseconds before the long press interaction is triggered. If you want users to hold down the pressable for a longer or shorter time before the long press triggers, right? So yeah, since I deleted that console log, we won't be able to test this. But basically, when we long press, here we decide how long do we want a long press to be before this is triggered. Then up next, we have hit slope. So this is particularly helpful when you have a small component and you want to expand the field where we can click. So if we increase hit slope, we'll be able to click outside this pressable. For example, if we put 20, we're able to click outside this pressable. So this is helpful when we have small components like radio buttons and you want the user to be able to click outside that view. Then up next, we have data property. So on data property, the first one is disabled. So right now we can freely click this pressable, but for whatever reason, we might want to disable that. So we'll say disabled set to true. And then now, once we do that, we can no longer click. Then up next, let's go to styles. So styles, we have our borderless ripple. So this works on Android. So let's go on Android preview. And whilst that opens, so this property allows you to define whether or not the ripple effect should respect the component's borders. If you enable borderless ripple, the ripple will extend beyond the boundaries of the pressable. This can give more expansive touch feedback, especially when working with edge-to-edge designs. So you're going to see what that means in a moment. So right now, notice when I click, right, I just see this opacity changing, right? And then if I say borderless ripple, this means that I want sort of like a visual ripple to come out when I click. So now when I click, notice this ripple. So that's the ripple that we're talking about. Then up next, we have ripple color. So this is the color of the ripple effect when the component is pressed. So right now, when we click, the ripple is like a dark color. We can have that be red. So now when we click, the ripple is going to be red. Notice how the ripple is now red. Then up next, we have foreground ripple. So this is particularly useful when you have other child components inside the pressable, such as images or views with their own background colors, and you want the ripple effect to show clearly over them. So yeah, for example, if we had another view inside here with this own background color and we clicked, maybe this, this ripple effect wouldn't be visible. But then when we clearly set the foreground ripple, it's going to bring this ripple to the foreground, thereby showing above all the other background colors that may be inside this component. Then up next, we have ripple radius. This property allows you to control the size of the ripple effect. If you want a more prominent or subtle ripple, you can adjust the ripple radius. So right now, it's very big, right? We can all agree. So if I put 20, it's going to be much more smaller. So this controls the size of our ripple. So now when I click, notice that our ripple is much more smaller. And then up next, we have disabled opacity. So this is the opacity when our pressable is disabled. So if we come here and then we set disable to true, right, you see this has a certain opacity that gets applied, right? You see it's now much more blurry and we're not able to see it properly. So we can control that opacity here. We can say, okay, I want it to even be more blurry. I say 0.1. And then now the disabled opacity is going to be it's now much more opaque, right? But then we barely can't see anything. So let's have like 0.6. All right, perfect. And yeah, that's a detailed overview of the pressable component in DraftBit. If you enjoyed this tutorial and want to see more, don't forget to subscribe and feel free to leave any questions in the comments. Yeah, thank you for watching.